God. Hey God. El. Jehovah. Allah. Adonai. Yahweh. Jah. El Shaddai. Elohim.
What the hell is it, you overcompensating hobbit freak?
That. Hell is it. Hell is exactly it.
What are you on about?
What are your omni traits?
I'm all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipresent, straight, non-corporeal.
Exactly. Intro, let's take Yahweh to task.
You blasphemous fuck.
God is a God of love, right? We hear it all the time about the Christian God, and yet, what does this God have to show for it? If we just look at the narrative, we have instances of genocide with the flood, and the absolute worst punishment imaginable for any being, hell. Now, hell for the Christian God isn't as descriptive as it is for the Muslim flavor of deity, Allah, where hell is described as a place where flesh is burned off and regrown over and over again. But this tends to happen with later retcons of repurposing any fiction. Some details get glossed over, and other details get more fleshed out as the narrative evolves. But we're not talking about Allah, so let's go back to Yahweh. Yahweh's 4 omni traits are commonly listed as follows: Omnipotent, or all-powerful, Omniscient, or all-knowing, Omnibenevolent, or all-loving, and Omnipresent, or all-present. So let's find a good working definition of one of these traits: love. There are 4 types of love represented in the Bible: Eros, or sexual love, Storge, or familial love, Philia, or the love found in friendship, and Agape, unconditional love. This is the love most usually ascribed to Yahweh. So, unconditional love, huh? Alright, we can work with that. Now, this being is all-loving, and in the Bible is being described as a being of love, and not just all-loving, so the metaphysical embodiment of love and goodness apparently created hell. And evil. Now, hear me out. I'm not going to focus on the killing during the flood or any of that jazz right now. I'm just going to focus on evil in general first. If God is the being who created everything, evil necessarily is part of that mix. Now, one could try to argue this away by saying God simply created free will, and evil is a necessary byproduct of free will, and thus God is still all-loving. This is, of course, ignoring the issue of omniscience. If God is all-knowing, then he knew the end result of the action of creating free will and would inevitably know that it led to evil. If he knows for a fact that his action will ultimately lead to evil, the action is not and cannot be all good in any way, shape, or form. Now, I've heard it argued that this isn't the case because evil is simply the absence of good, and since God is the greatest good in their worldview, that bit of evil doesn't mean anything of importance. However, I'd argue that in issues of morality, in good or evil, there are not 1 or 2 options, there are at least 3. For instance, an action can be immoral or evil, depending on how you want to use those terms, or the action could be moral or good. However, there is a third option: amoral. An action can be amoral, or in other words, an action that has nothing to do with good or evil. Amoral actions are the result of an absence of good. They're also the absence of evil, or immorality. So when I hear that the absence of good is evil, and thus nullifies the whole issue of omnibenevolence, I call bullcrap. Amoral actions are actions that are absent of goodness, or evil. Evil actions are not the absence of good, and good actions are not the absence of evil. They are opposites. So, necessarily, Yahweh has actions that necessarily created evil. As an omniscient being, knowing full well what this would lead to, it's ultimately God's fault for the creation of evil. For creating anything, I'd argue it must be within that being's nature. To create evil would make evil within God's nature. A being whose nature includes evil could not and cannot be omnibenevolent. That's just my take on it. But that's only half of the issue. The other half is, of course, the doctrine about hell. In most views that aren't annihilationist, which is the view that ceasing to exist is the punishment for fallen angels and sinners, hell is a place of eternal punishment. Hellfire, and all that other fleshy, burning, sizzling fun stuff. Now, I can understand some people considering that hellfire is a viable punishment for not believing in their God, or really any reprehensible action, until we get to the issue of eternity. The only beings who can even fathom eternity in a Christian worldview are beings who are in fact eternal. They know what it's like to always be, and never to not be. We, however, do not have that capacity. I want you to imagine, for just a second, that your life is the length of an inch. Just an inch, essentially 2 fingers long. Everyone else has the life of roughly the same length, and, that's fine. Now, to give you perspective on what eternity looks like compared to that, how big are your 2 fingers compared to, say, your house? Your house is probably what? Maybe 50 feet long? Let's go with that. That's about 600 inches. So 600 times the length of your finger, you'd have to live 600 lifetimes to even manage to cross the length of your house. That's a long time, but it's not eternity. Let's make that scale massive. How big around is the world? Well, the circumference of the world is about 1.5778 billion inches around, so with these measurements, that's 1.5 billion lifetimes. That's already incomprehensible. That's more time than human beings have been on the Earth already. But what does that look like compared to eternity? Well, on an eternal scale, that length is so tiny, you can't even see it by comparison. That is eternity. And I know that my comparison might not really make much sense, because comparing finite time to eternity does not make any sense. The two are not comparable. They're not even compatible. So why is infinite punishment compatible with finite crimes? I personally don't care how heinous the crime. Infinite punishment can never in any way be a just and fair punishment for finite crimes of any kind. I've already made a video about the concept of hell, and why even the salvation doctrine doesn't save or justify it. So, an omni being, fully aware of this, who is supposed to be all-loving, how could this being possibly create hell? I'd argue the being creating hell automatically rules out any argument that this being could possibly be considered loving, or even good. Simply having the capacity for evil already rules out omnibenevolence, but once you consider hell, no matter how good this being may have been, the construction of hell automatically tips the scales into Yahweh being a god of evil, masquerading as a being of goodness. But here's the thing, I don't have to argue that God is all evil. Simply being somewhat evil already rules him out of being all good. Simply having the capacity for evil rules out this deity being a being of all-encompassing goodness. God cannot be omnibenevolent or all good while also being all-knowing. Period. But there is one last nail in the coffin. Someone could argue that God chose maximum goodness, and a maximally good world contains free will, and here we are. But there's a problem with this. The word maximum. There's another omni trait this deity has that cannot be overlooked. Omnipotence. This being is all-powerful. Logically all-powerful, at least. For this being to have a maximum in any capacity puts a limit on his power. Your God can't be limited in how he had to construct our world and human beings as we know them. If your deity can't create maximum goodness without evil, he is not omnipotent. To create the evil by any means rules him out of being omnibenevolent. You're left with 2 omni traits, omniscience and omnipresence. And I may tackle those in another video, but for now, I think this might be plenty to mull over, as this was kind of exhausting to write. I know when I made my arguments against God video, a lot of people had some backlash that I did not actually include arguments against God that I considered a little more tenable. So this is the first part in a series of attempts at that. So, what did you guys think?
Actually, Suris, you've been arguing against a straw man this whole time.
What?
You thought it was God, but it was me, godless Iowan.
So my entire argument falls flat then?
No, silly Suris, Yahweh's for kids. I mean, not real. Yahweh's not real.
Oh, so my argument—
Fuck off, Suris.